Welcome to Module 4. In this lecture, I will briefly overview issues related to traumatic memory. The effects of trauma, as seen in post-traumatic stress disorder, include not only the intrusive re-experiencing of traumatic memory, but also the avoidance of the reminders of the trauma. A person experiencing PTSD can go beyond avoidance, however, and may be unable to recall an important aspect of the trauma, a phenomenon termed dissociative amnesia. In the other materials for this class, focused on the neurobiological effects of trauma, you will become acquainted with several of the specific pathways that trauma is disruptive of brain functioning. While it's also apparent in these materials that there may be attendant disruptions in memory consolidation following trauma, and that dissociative amnesia plays a role, we also need to briefly cover issues more broadly related to memory in the clinical and research worlds as well. To start, I'd like to remind you of some of the changes in the body that happen due to trauma and its effects. Trauma has the potential to disrupt several systems in the body in an enduring way. There can be psychophysiological effects, which happen at the time of the trauma, and which may persist in reaction to reminders of the trauma, which we call triggers. The psychophysiological effects include extreme autonomic arousal, such as an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, and also hyperarousal, which includes effects such as reduced pain tolerance, anxiety, exaggerated startle reflex, insomnia, and fatigue. In addition to these psychophysiological effects, there can be disruptions to the neurohormonal systems as well. One such effect is to lower serotonin levels, which can lead to impulsivity, sleep problems, and aggression. Another neurohormonal effect is for the body to increase the level of endogenous opioids in an effort to help us feel better, which can make you feel numb and interfere with memory as well. High levels of catecholamines, including epinephrine and norepinephrine, and also glucocorticoids, can make a person feel anxious, panicked, and interfere with memory. These are the hormones that allow us to produce that fight or flight or freeze reaction that enables energy to be focused in the way that we need in these situations. However, what is adaptive in the first place can become maladaptive over time. In other words, the effects of these chemical changes can be enduring, and triggers of trauma can continue to produce these reactions. Compounding this is the fact that with the exposure to repeated chronic stress, our natural opioids can be depleted, leaving us more at risk for depression, among other problems. So overall, it is clear that the psychophysiological and neurohormonal effects of trauma and reminders of the trauma can disrupt attention, learning, and memory. In addition to the required modules for this module, there are several good articles about the effects of trauma on memory in the additional resources section. Although we know quite a lot about the effects of trauma on memory, it's important for us as clinicians treating trauma to know that this is not without controversy. Specifically, this controversy is centered on whether it's possible for a person to completely repress memories of past trauma, whether it's possible to induce a quote-unquote false memory in a person, in other words, lead a person to believe something happened when it never actually did. In the modern era, this starts with Sigmund Freud's work. Freud published some very controversial papers in the late 19th century, which outlined what he called the seduction theory, which was based on experiences that he had working with clients and their psychological problems, and them recounting early childhood sexual molestation incidents. Often, Freud and his contemporaries used hypnosis to help a person to regress to earlier stages in their development to uncover the roots of their problems. This was all very controversial at the time, and due to the reaction to it, within a few years, he abandoned this theory and instead became convinced that these memories of sexual abuse that the clients had shared with him were instead imaginal fantasies. This led him to develop a whole new theory of infantile sexuality and ultimately led to the development of the psychosexual stages of childhood that you have no doubt read about. This had the effect of causing many therapists to come to believe that reported sexual abuse was largely fantasy. Currently, there's much criticism of the whole notion of Freud's psychosexual stages, but it's important to know that this thinking has held sway for many years. Eventually, many did come to believe that their clients were actually telling them about real memories of childhood sexual abuse and began publishing about this and changing the discourse. But not everyone believed this. So here you have what has actually been termed the memory wars, with some on one side believing that a person can fully repress memories of abuse and that these memories can later be recovered, and with others who think that in the process of trying to uncover so-called repressed memories, that what is actually happening is that either the client is creating these false memories or that the client's therapist is leading them to create false memories of something that actually never happened. On the side of recovered memories, you have feminists like Laura Davis and Ellen Bass, who in the 90s published the very popular self-help book, The Courage to Heal, which is still in print today and which, among other things, outlines how a person could get help for dealing with recovered memories and doing memory work. In addition to their book, the most high-profile battle in this war has been fought by a family of academics in a very public way. Psychologist Jennifer Freyd recovered memories of her father, mathematician Peter Freyd, of having sexually abused her as a child and privately accused him of this. In turn, he and his wife Pamela started the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, comprised initially of other parents who had been similarly accused. What they and the researchers who latched onto their ideas argue is that memory is fallible and that memory can be influenced and distorted, whether by the person themselves or by unethical therapeutic interventions. Oftentimes in this so-called war, therapists have been accused of implanting false memories of childhood abuse. However, there has not to date been any empirical evidence supporting these allegations, but there has been a lot of back and forth. Jennifer Freyd and her colleagues went on to develop and research the concept of betrayal trauma as a result of all this, which they refer to as something that occurs when people or institutions on which a person depends for survival significantly violate that person's trust or well-being. Examples of this would be childhood physical, emotional, or sexual abuse perpetrated by a caregiver. There are many researchers who do believe that fully dissociating from trauma is possible, and that these dissociated memories can indeed be recovered at a later date. A notable online resource for this perspective is the Recovered Memory Project, hosted by Brown University. One of the most prominent researchers on the other side of this quote-unquote memory war is Elizabeth Loftus, who is a cognitive psychologist who has written extensively on false memory and is an expert witness for legal cases that involve recovered memory. She and other researchers who share her perspective argue that memory is fallible and that memory can be influenced or distorted or fabricated, and that those scoring highly on measures of dissociation are more likely to generally have worse memory and make more false recalls. Adding to this debate is the idea of motivated forgetting. This refers to deficits in memory that are more volitional in nature. Steve Sessi of Cornell University explains this by saying, think of some embarrassing event when you were a teenager. You're not going to dwell on it, but you can recollect it if someone reminds you. Likewise, people can have horrible experiences and not think about them for decades, but are capable of retrieving them when questioned. So, it's a complicated story on memory. We could probably spend a whole semester really looking into this. But for now, I want you to understand some of the basic history about the memory controversy. So where are we now? My opinion is that we are moving away from this debate and instead focusing more on dissociation. Specifically, we're now looking at dissociative amnesia. Dissociative amnesia occurs when a person blocks out certain information, usually associated with stressful or traumatic events, leaving him or her unable to remember important personal information. This memory loss goes beyond normal forgetfulness and includes gaps in memories for long periods of time or of memories specifically involving the traumatic event. The literature overwhelmingly recognizes that dissociative amnesia is a feature of some survivors' experience. The dramatic high-profile cases of complete memory repression and later recovery are the exception. Most often it appears this is a partial process. In other words, it's rare to have total amnesia. Most people remember that something bad happened, but develop mechanisms of defense, including dissociative amnesia, to shield themselves from the most distressing aspects of these memories. Knowing what we know now about dissociation, it's perfectly plausible that memories of childhood sexual abuse could be buried for years and then recalled, and that either motivated forgetting or dissociative amnesia plays a role in making that happen. Therefore, polarizing the debate as either repression and recovery on one side and false memory on the other simply doesn't make sense anymore. So what is dissociative amnesia? It occurs when a person blocks out certain information, usually associated with a stressful or traumatic event, leaving him or her unable to remember important personal information. With this disorder, the degree of memory loss goes beyond normal forgetfulness, and like I said, includes gaps in memory for long periods of time or of memories involving the traumatic event. In the literature review article by Molly Wolf and Tom Najowski that we read for this module, they talk about some of the moderating and mediating risk factors for developing dissociative amnesia. First, there are demographic risk factors that moderate dissociation. One is age, with the risk being that the higher for the younger a person was when the abuse occurred. There are mixed results for gender, with some studies showing that males have less recall of childhood sexual abuse and other studies not showing this effect. Ethnicity also appears to be an issue, with some studies showing that African American individuals may be experiencing more dissociative amnesia than Caucasian individuals. There are also characteristics related to the abuse exposure itself that can influence whether or not a person develops dissociative amnesia. The relationship to the perpetrator matters in that the research shows that the closer you are to the person who abused you, the more likely you are to dissociate. The frequency and duration of the abuse also makes a person more vulnerable, as does the severity of the abuse. The more severe, the more risk. Other abuse characteristics that matter are polyvictimization, that is being exposed to different types of trauma, and also having more perpetrators. There are also personal and environmental risk factors for developing dissociative amnesia. Those who have the opportunity to repeatedly disclose their abuse in the form of legal involvement appear to be less at risk for dissociative amnesia, especially when their disclosure is supported by the non-offending parent or caregiver. On the other hand, children do not disclose abuse when they do not feel supported, and if they do not feel maternal or social support, they are more at risk for dissociative amnesia. Finally, a person's natural tendency or ability to dissociate is also a risk factor. It is not surprising, perhaps, that the literature shows that there are increases in symptoms of post-traumatic stress, increased usage of avoidance and dissociation as coping mechanisms, and increased risk for depression and anxiety for those who have experienced dissociative amnesia. And all of these have implications for our work with survivors of abuse. Wherever the evolving science on trauma and memory leads, there are implications for best practices for working with clients who may be experiencing memory problems related to their abuse. As our assigned 2001 article by Christine Courtois for this module suggests, the memory controversy has had a profound impact on clinical practice. She begins her article by providing history of the controversy, and then also discusses how a rational ground has eventually emerged, which includes some common points of understanding. She also presents the findings of several task forces who work to achieve these common understandings. But what's really important to take away from all of this are the clinical implications. So Courtois summarized and synthesized the findings of these various groups and came up with these general treatment issues and recommendations. The first is to practice within established professional code of ethics and practice standards, meaning that not to treat clients with a history of abuse or trauma as if they are so unique that they need special treatments that don't conform to commonly accepted professional standards. The second is to develop specialized knowledge and competence, meaning that we should stay up to speed on issues related to abuse, memory, and post-trauma treatments as they evolve. The third is to maintain awareness of transference, countertransference, secondary traumatization, and self-care issues that we'll be covering in more detail in future modules. The fourth is to provide information about treatment and establish a therapeutic contract with the prospective and ongoing client, and that's going to include informed consent, providing plenty of information about your treatments and what you'll be doing together, and entering into a collaborative relationship to make those things happen. The fifth recommendation is to begin with the psychosocial assessment, including questions about past trauma and abuse, and use of psychological testing and ancillary assessments as needed. Courtois' sixth recommendation is to develop a diagnostic formulation over time and only after considering a range of information. In other words, we shouldn't be making instant diagnoses. The seventh is to follow the consensus model of sequence treatment. In other words, treatment progresses through stages. Stage 1 is all about personal safety, stabilization, self-management, skill building, resolving immediate crises, that sort of thing. Stage 2 is where you get into working with the traumatic material, the content, the emotions, and that's going to be really tailored to the client's needs, both for what you're doing and the pace of things. Stage 3 is about working with the personal and interpersonal issues that remain after you've worked with the trauma, after you've had some trauma resolution. The eighth recommendation is to ascertain personal and professional assumptions and biases and work for a stance of supportive neutrality. In other words, figure out where you stand on this memory controversy and figure out a way to tolerate the uncertainty of it all. Here, Courtois alludes to a statement by Judith Herman that I really like. She says that a therapist needs to be technically neutral but morally cognizant to the prevalence and possibility of abuse. Couldn't put it in any other better way. The ninth implication is to watch assumptions about incomplete and spotty memory for childhood. We can't automatically assume that those incomplete memories are related to abuse. The 10th is to not automatically assume sexual abuse from a set of symptoms. No one set of symptoms is conclusively associated with abuse. The 11th is to be open to the possibility of other childhood trauma besides sexual abuse. There are a wide variety of crises that could cause symptoms. The 12th recommendation is to keep adequate records. These should be sufficient to document the primary issues, events in treatment, and any and all communications with clients. The 13th is to follow existing guidelines for memory retrieval work when using any method. And we should know that while hypnosis is still being used, it is controversial from a forensic point of view and should not be used if the client is directly involved in legal proceedings. The 14th guideline is to ascertain the individual's understanding and expectations about memory, therapy, and any sources of influence and social compliance, and to correct any misinformation. What this means is that the therapist should engage in a model of open-ended inquiry and have a scientific attitude over time, especially for unclear or fragmentary memories. In other words, the therapist shouldn't attempt to fill in any of the gaps or confirm or disconfirm suspicions of unrecalled abuse history, but rather help the client explore the content and meaning of these fragments with an open mind. The 15th recommendation is that when you're recommending self-help books and groups for survivors, do this judiciously and only when you're really familiar with the content and perspective. In other words, know and understand what you're recommending. The 16th guideline is to support the client's search for corroboration and quote-unquote proof of the crimes against them after adequate exploration and preparation in therapy, after the client has achieved a relative degree of life and symptom stability. The 17th implication is do not recommend family cutoffs on the basis of recovered memory alone. If there's no clear-cut information about any ongoing danger, the therapist should be cautious about recommending that the client sever ties with their family of origin. If there is clear-cut information, however, the therapist might be mandated to take action on the other hand. The 18th implication is to contract with your client for no unplanned or impulsive disclosures, confrontations, or legal initiatives without extensive discussion in therapy first. Getting involved in these kinds of actions is risky even for those who have very clear memories and evidence. And as a result, clients should be fully prepared before taking such actions. The 19th recommendation is to not encourage or suggest a lawsuit. That's not the therapist's role. Litigation is enormously stressful, and the client needs to be the one to make such an impactful decision. So to summarize, it's kind of just been a brief overview, and you'll read more about it in the required readings. If you want to look into it more, like I said, there's more in the additional resources. But overall, it's clear that interpreting the effects of trauma on memory is controversial, but that the debate is evolving toward a focus on dissociative amnesia. When working with survivors, it's important that therapists not suggest nor suppress memories of abuse or trauma, but instead maintain a stance of supportive neutrality. Additionally, we must remember that recovering memories is not the goal, but rather it is helping our clients to improve their overall state of well-being and functioning. So thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.